So if anybody's interested in attending a gardening type webinar at noon on a Wednesday, you can give me an email. My email address is dhc3@cornell.edu. It's on that screen there, below the wine glass there, my homemade graphic. And just let us know you'd like to be included in the notifications for the Lunch in the Garden webinars. And I'll show you that email address again at the end of the program in case you want to join in. So I'm going to make my picture bigger here, and we can get started. So there we go. And here we are. So this is a program I put together many, many years ago called Gardens of the Hudson Valley. And this was actually the last presentation I made using slides. Everybody here maybe can remember slides when you had film cameras and you took film pictures and you developed them, and then you got these tiny little slides you put in a Kodak tray and went around and showed slideshows. So a lot of these pictures, or some of these pictures, are from the slide days, and I digitized them. They're not as good as more modern pictures. Some of the photographs here tonight are new, and some of them are stolen from the internet. But I have to say that I have been to all of these gardens multiple times, although not recently because of the restrictions on travel. I just haven't gone anywhere this year. But at least this program will give you the basics of several of the gardens in the Hudson Valley. We're not going to go to all of them. Unfortunately, the program would probably be about 3 hours long if we included every garden. So we're just going to hit the highlights and see some of the major gardens in the Hudson Valley. So we're going to go starting from Manhattan. But before we do that, I do have a handout for this. And again, back in the slideshow days, or when we could do these meetings in person, I'd hand you this paper and you could follow along. But if anybody would like a copy of this, send me an email at dhc3@cornell.edu, and I can either mail you a paper copy or I can send you a digital copy. And this is a list of the gardens. It was done in 2016. It has some of the admission information, the hours and those things. And of course, you'd want to check this before you got in the car and started driving, especially this year, because I don't know what the state of these gardens is. I don't know how open they are. Probably most of them are open at this point, I would imagine, but certainly do check before you go anywhere, especially a great distance. So let's go down to Manhattan and work our way north. And we are going to be going up along the Hudson River. The first garden here is the High Line. Now the High Line is a fairly new garden. It's along the Hudson River side of Manhattan, and it's a 1.45 mile long linear park that's built on top of an old elevated railroad system. This was the New York Central spur called the West Side Line, and this railroad was above all the streets and went into the 3rd and 4th stories of the big factory buildings in this area. Now this fell into disuse many, many years ago. Weeds grew on top of it, and somebody or a group of people were inspired by an old railroad that was reclaimed in Paris and planted as a garden. So this eventually became the idea here in Manhattan, and it was named the High Line. And the first section was opened in 2009. The third section opened in 2014. And I haven't been back for a few years, but when I was there, it was a very, very crowded place. And now over 8 million visitors go to the High Line every year. And you can see in the pictures here, it runs under big buildings, it runs between big buildings, and you get these incredible views of the Manhattan skyline. And there's all sorts of interesting plants here. The planting is done in a very naturalistic way. There's a lot of native plants, and the little picture up the top kind of shows some of the railroad ties and the rails that were left in place to give you the idea that this was a railroad. And you can see here it goes above the streets and kind of twists and turns a little bit. So it's a really interesting structure. It's got an interesting history and then very interesting plantings. And of course, since it's in Manhattan, you get lots of interesting people watching. I've only been there 3 times, I think, and always in summer, high summer, but there's always something in bloom. They have a lot of different types of plants here and a lot of native plants used very creatively. So it's a lot of fun to see the horticulture. The picture on the left there shows some of the crazy architecture that's been built in that area. This High Line has really rejuvenated this part of Manhattan and made a very attractive place to live. So of course it's very expensive. And here's a turf lawn in Manhattan. So that's a rare thing. We kind of take our turf lawns for granted in our part of the world, but down there, that's a very hot commodity looking at that lovely grass. And of course, there's sumac in that lower picture and just lots of people enjoying this high line. So it's a really cool place and very modern, probably the most modern and up-to-date garden in the Hudson Valley that we have for the time being. So we go a little farther north and we go into the Bronx. And here we have a garden called Wave Hill. And you can see in the color photograph there, we're overlooking the Palisades. So we are very close to the Hudson River. And Wave Hill is in the northern part of the Bronx in an area called Riverdale. It's the site of two old estates that dated back to the 1840s. And on these old estates, there were many famous residents, including Arturo Toscanini, Teddy Roosevelt, and Samuel Clemens, all spent time or lived in this area. In 1893, a man named George W. Perkins bought these estates and built a greenhouse and some of the gardens that can still be seen there today. And the gardens are very innovative. There was a horticulturist named Marco Polo Stufano who was very famous in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and did a lot of very bold planting. And there's lots of different types of gardens to see: an old-fashioned garden, an aquatic garden, a wild garden, an herb garden, and much more. So Wave Hill is this real beautiful oasis in the Bronx. Here's a picture I took of it many years ago in winter. And then there's lilies and peonies in the color gardens there. The picture in the upper left part is the wild garden. And at that point, there were foxgloves when I visited that year. And the other upper picture in the right-hand corner looks a little bit like a plant flea market. There's all sorts of pots there. And those are actually what we call troughs, hypertufa troughs or stone planters. They have a wonderful collection of those there. And often people grow rock garden plants in those little containers because they have very good drainage. So if you have some of these tiny rock garden plants that would be, native to alpine situations high up on a mountain, they might get lost in a normal garden, so you grow those in these hypertufa troughs. And the picture on the bottom is the herb garden, and again, you can see the beautiful view of the Hudson River there. Lots of shady places, gravel walkways, benches. Again, you don't think you're in the city here. It's, again, a lovely oasis, and there's the aquatic garden. So Wave Hill is a very, very beautiful place. And when I lived in Westchester years ago, we would go down to Wave Hill a couple times a year because it was just such a fun place to visit. And the other thing that I really learned about at Wave Hill many years ago were these chairs. And I saw these chairs at Wave Hill, and then I started going to some of the other Hudson Valley gardens, and these chairs that look sort of like an Adirondack chair but are much more upright were in these various gardens. And I thought, wow, this has got to be some Hudson Valley kind of thing. But in reality, these were chairs that were dreamed up by a Danish architect named Rietveld. So they're called Rietveld chairs. And at Wave Hill, you can actually, or at one time, they used to sell plans. You could go home and make yourself a Rietveld chair. And I in fact did that. I have one in my backyard. So I consider myself part of this Hudson Valley elite that have a Rietveld chair in their Hudson Valley garden. But you can go online and make one too. They're really quite easy to make, and they're quite comfortable. They're a little higher up than an Adirondack chair. So those of us that are getting a little older maybe can get out of them a little bit easier. Okay, we go north again to a place called Kykuit. And this is in the Pocantico Hills, the Tarrytown or Sleepy Hollow area of Westchester County, kind of the middle of Westchester County, along the Hudson River. And Kykuit is an old Dutch word for a rocky hilltop. And that's exactly what this site is. It's up on the top of one of the ridges of rock there, and it has wonderful views. So in the 1890s, John D. Rockefeller acquired 3,500 acres in this area in the Pocantico Hills and started working on this house in 1906. And you can see this is one of those small places in the country, I guess you would say, in terms of Rockefeller prestige or Rockefeller standards. And the estate became developed at that time. The original landscape designer was Olmsted, the Olmsted office up in Boston, but Mr. Rockefeller decided he didn't really like the Olmsted designs, and he went and hired another man named William Wells Bosworth, who was a very famous Hudson Valley estate designer. And some of these other estates that you can visit were designed by Mr. Bosworth. The gardens you can see there today are mostly formal, with Italian, English, and French styles mixed together. And they certainly are of the period of that turn of the century. Nelson A. Rockefeller, who was the grandson of John B., lived here from 1963 to 1979, and he added some of the modern sculpture you can find here. So this is, again, open to the public. You can get on a tour and they'll take you around. So you can see in these pictures, there's lots of clipped hedges, there's topiary, fountains, a green garden for the most part. The picture on the left was one of the early visits I made there in the very early spring, and that's supposed to be a stream garden. And of course, they haven't turned the water on yet, so it's just really a rocky kind of a structure. And then the pictures on the right are of the tea house and the tea garden. And you can see the tea house. I think of tea houses as a small wooden building, maybe with a tile or a shingle roof, but the Rockefeller tea house is stone. It's magnificent, and it overlooks a fountain and a parterre garden. So very formal in design here. And again, statuary, balance, formal balance type of views, wrought iron gates, stone walls. It's not a, touchy-feely kind of loose or free type of landscape. It's very formal and very structured. So certainly if you think of landscape design in terms of economics, this is a power garden. This is obviously somebody that has a lot of money to spend and a lot of means. And some of the more amusing parts of the garden to me were the modern art by Nelson A. Rockefeller. Kind of brought sort of a feeling of levity to some of the areas of the estate, especially that colorful sculpture there, because we know he was a great patron of the arts. Okay, so that's Kai Cut. Now also, I have one other thing I have to tell you about that written down on my notes here. There's a witticism, and I really should look up and see who really said this, but I have written down that the witticism is, it's what God would have built if he had the money. That was somebody's observation about Kai Cut. So definitely a power garden. Okay, so next we go to a place called PepsiCo. Now PepsiCo, you can kind of imagine, is built on the fortune of Pepsi-Cola and all of the related things that are involved in PepsiCo. I think they own Kentucky Fried Chicken, and they own Fritos and all sorts of snack foods. And I think they have branched out to some healthier options, but you might say that this is a garden built on things we shouldn't be eating so much of, but certainly that's a very American thing. It is a very lovely garden though. So this is called the Donald M. Kendall Sculpture Garden at PepsiCo. It's in a part of Westchester called Purchase, and Purchase is not too close to the river. We're actually over by the Connecticut border and Greenwich, so it's a little bit further away from the river. And this garden was named for Donald M. Kendall, who was the chairman of the company, who moved the company to this site in 1965. Now, when you think about the 1950s and 60s, a lot of the big companies were moving out of the cities and getting these kind of campuses out in the suburbs. So this is a big sprawling corporate headquarters that would normally be surrounded by acres and acres of lawn. And PepsiCo decided to get a little bit better than that. They have acres and acres of lawn, but they also have a sculpture park that's open to the public. So there's lots of interesting sculpture to see here. And you can see that there's this golden pathway. And you walk on the golden pathway and it takes you in a big loop around the entire property, and you get to visit the different sculptures and see the different garden areas. So I really like the big orange sculpture there. I'm not an art person. I'm not knowledgeable about art at all, but I kind of know what I like. And they have a really great collection at PepsiCo. The grasses there, I put that picture in because starting in the 1980s, ornamental grasses really took off as a garden feature, and they have a wonderful grass garden at PepsiCo. Again, lots of fun sculptures you can walk through the landscape and see here. I haven't been to PepsiCo in quite a while, so I don't know if these sculptures are all still there. I think these were part of the permanent collection, so I would think that most of them still are. I know they have done some renovations of the garden in recent years. And there's about 112 acres and over 40 sculptures to see. So lots to see here and a wonderful place to wander through. And this is not the greatest picture in the world. This was the old film camera, but you can see the black mondo grass that's been planted under the sculpture, and then the very dark purple leaf beeches kind of go together in a dark kind of theme there, this dark purple color. These pictures are of the water garden, or the aquatic garden, and this was a part of the property that was developed by a man named Russell Page. And Russell Page was a great English landscape designer who worked at PepsiCo from 1981 to 1985. And this water garden is really quite lovely. It's sort of all at one level, and the turf and the water kind of blend together and have this very flat kind of feeling. And then you've got lots of interesting aquatic plants surrounding it. So that was always one of my favorite parts of PepsiCo. Okay, now we go a little farther north again, and we go to a place called Boscobel. Now, Boscobel has got, again, a very interesting history. You can see in the upper picture there, I didn't take that picture. I stole that from the internet, or I would have had to have hired a drone or something. But you can see we're in the part of the Hudson Valley that's called the Highlands. This is in Putnam County, near the town of Garrison, or the village of Garrison. But this house didn't start out life there. This house, which you can see in these two pictures, was built in 1804 by a man named Stotts Morris Dykeman. And Stotts Morris Dykeman happened to make a fortune in the Revolutionary War, but he made it in maybe not such a wonderful way by our standards. He was a loyalist, and he supplied the British Army with supplies so they could, try to thwart the American Revolution. So that's how he made his fortune. Now, I'm not quite sure of his history, but he didn't get run off to Canada. He stayed here, and he built this house quite a few years after the Revolution was over, and he must have traded places and become a good American because he built this wonderful house. It's described as a New York federal house. But this house was originally built in a place called Montrose, which today is in Westchester County, a little further down the river. And there it was. But in 1945, the federal government wanted to build a new hospital, and they chose the property that this house stood on. So the house was going to be torn down. Now, back in the 1940s, I guess we started to have a lot of interest in historic preservation, luckily, and a group funded by Lila Atchison Wallace, who made her family money, or their family money, from the Reader's Digest books, actually bought the house for $35. And they moved it up the river, and then they restored it at this site near Garrison. So luckily, back in the 40s, these folks had the wherewithal and the vision to save this house and move it upstream and put it in a safe place of a very spectacular nature you can see from the views there. So that was restored and opened in the 1960s, and today there's an herb garden, a rose garden that has over 300 types of roses, and a circular fountain and some other plantings. So it's a very lovely spot. Of course, these gardens are not original to the house because the gardens would have been left behind down in Montrose. So these gardens are recreations of what gardens might have been surrounding a house in the early 1800s. So they're very beautiful and very lovely, but they're not exactly duplicates, or they don't have historic references there. This is one of my favorite parts of the garden. It's called an orangerie. And of course, that would have been a feature in a French garden, maybe, or certainly an Italian garden where you would have kept your orange trees over winter. A structure for that was called an orangerie. And there's an herb garden there, and a bee skep where the honeybees would have been kept. So it's a lovely, lovely place and very well maintained and very good looking garden. Okay, also in Putnam County, we go to a place called Stonecrop. Now, Stonecrop is a very, very interesting garden if you really like plants, because they have lots of interesting and unusual plants at Stonecrop, and it's a plantsman's garden, or that's what a plant person's garden, I should say. This garden was the home of a man named Frank Cabot. Now, Frank Cabot was the founder of the Garden Conservancy. He was a very wealthy man, but he really loved horticulture, and this is just one of his gardens. He also had a garden up in Canada along the St. Lawrence River called the Four Seasons, and that is regarded as one of the best gardens in the world. Of course, I haven't been there, unfortunately, but I believe you can actually get access to it. It was a private garden for many years. I think you can get tours of the Four Seasons now. And Frank Cabot was the star or the subject of a movie called The Gardener that features the Four Seasons garden. So if you're bored and you want to watch a good gardening movie, it's one of those you can find on, I don't know if you can find it on Netflix. I did watch it over the winter and it was a really interesting show. But Frank Cabot's garden in Putnam County is called Stonecrop, and that's where we are here. This is a 63-acre garden. About 12 acres are in gardens, and it's on a very rocky hilltop at about 1,100 feet. Interesting thing in this picture is that conservatory there that appears to be floating on water. And that's not one of the older features at Stonecrop. That wasn't there when I first started going there, but that's been a later addition. It's a greenhouse that looks like it's floating in a pond. And how often do you see something like that? The other pictures there are, again, of the stone troughs or the hypertufa troughs that grow the alpine plants, and they're a very popular feature of Stonecrop. Lots of different plantings there. This garden is the walled garden, and you can see the top picture, there's tulips and the spring flowering bulbs, and then the lower pictures, which I took on one of my visits a few years ago. The garden was full of things that flower in summer, and very big and bold plants like cannas and dahlias, lots of texture, lots of color. It's a lot of fun. So a very exuberantly planted garden. This is the pond that we're standing in the rock garden going down to the pond, and you can see the hills down by the Hudson River in the far distance. There's a stone bridge across that, and those are dawn redwood trees that were planted there. And then the lower picture, there's a gazebo, I guess you could call it, or a summer house covered in wisteria. So again, lots of interesting plants, strange things in the rock garden, lots of little things that bloom, lots of strange weeping plants and things with colored foliage, lots of fun things to wander around and see. There's also a lovely woodland garden, and the top picture there, of course, is the yellow lady slipper, and the bottom there is the pagoda dogwood. So not necessarily native plants, but really plants from all over the world, many unusual things, many new kinds of plants. So Stonecrop is a wonderful place to visit. It's back in the woods. You have to go up a steep dirt road to get there, but it is open to the public. When I started going there, you had to have an appointment, and it was kind of fun because you felt like you were really going into someplace secret. Now it's more open to the public, and lots of people go and visit. So definitely a great place to take an advantage of. Okay, we go farther north again into Dutchess County, and we are actually not too close to the river. We're on the eastern side of Dutchess County, over towards the Connecticut border in a place called Amenia, and this is called Weathersfield or Weathersfield Farm. And this is in horse country. You go over in this part of the county, and there's lots of horse farms, lovely rolling open fields, and still working farms of different types. And the man that created this, his name was Chauncey Stillman, and he started this estate in 1937. He was of the Rockefeller family. I'm not quite sure how exactly he was related, but he had the means to create a lovely garden nevertheless. And Chauncey Stillman had lots of different interests. that sound like a lot of fun to me. He was the Commodore of the New York Yacht Club, which must have been a good time. He was the director of the National Audubon Society, so he was interested in birds and nature. He was also a director of the New York Botanical Garden, so he really liked plants. And also, he really liked carriage driving. And I had been to Wethersfield many times and never seen the carriage collection until the last time we went, and we had a tour and we saw the carriage collection, which was a lot of fun. It was really interesting to see these beautiful carriages that he had. And he must have had some wonderful horses in the stables. But this garden is really an Italian garden, or an Italian influenced garden. A lot of the gardens in Italy are on hilltops or hillsides, and they overlook the country surrounding them. And that's exactly what Wethersfield does. You can get that idea in this picture here. They tend to be formal. They're statuary. You can see these wonderful steps going down, and there's an urn in the distance, and some formally pruned hedges. There's terraces, lots of green clipped plants, not so many flowers in all the garden, although there are flowering flower plant areas, but it's a restful sort of a garden, and lots of pruning, lots of sheared plants here. Again, another picture of what the garden looks like, probably just about this time of the year, middle to late August, because that's the sweet autumn clematis that's blooming along that hedge there, again, overlooking the lovely Dutchess County countryside. The picture on the right is of a belvedere, or sort of a little summer house that you can walk up to and again overlook the countryside. And the picture on the left I took many years ago in the springtime, and you can see there's a flowering dogwood and some rhododendron, but then there's all these clipped yews. There's a crazy looking plant on the right hand side there. That's a clipped weeping beech, something you don't see very often, but they have that at Wethersfield. So lots of pruning. If you were a gardener working at Wethersfield, I think you'd spend maybe half your life pruning and shearing these different hedges. This picture shows the reflecting pool, which actually started out as a swimming pool, and that must have been a lot of fun to swim there. And in the background there, you can kind of get an idea of what they call an arborvitae alley. Those arborvitae are that alley, it doesn't look like it in my picture, but it's 190 feet long, and it goes back, and there's a little sculpture in the background there. And the arborvitae are 24 feet tall, and somebody has to prune all that. So they do keep the gardeners busy. This is a picture of the flower garden, the cutting garden, and of course a house of this type would have had floral displays inside the house as well as the gardens outside. So they would have been cutting flowers out of these cutting gardens, which are very colorful. And one of my favorite parts of Wethersfield is this little area up by the house. This is a very shady garden. It's called a runnel, and a runnel is an Islamic garden feature, a narrow channel of water. And then that small picture on the left-hand side, you can see this narrow, elongated channel of water, and then there's a sculpture at the end. And it's just a very peaceful little place. This water may be making a small trickling noise, but very, very calm, a few potted plants there, and a very shady kind of atmosphere. So that is Wethersfield Farm, a beautiful, beautiful place to visit. We stay in Dutchess County, but we go over towards Millbrook. And Millbrook is in sort of the middle of Dutchess County, and again, in an area of lots of estates. And this one is called Innisfree, or the Innisfree Garden. Now, Innisfree is built around a pond, and it's a naturalistic landscape, and it's really kind of a one-of-a-kind place. You know, I've been to a lot of different gardens, and Innisfree definitely has its own vibe. It sort of has a mystical feeling to it. I don't know how exactly to describe it, but it's definitely got a spirit there. At least that's what I've thought when I visited it. And I've been there in the spring, summer, and fall, and it really is a beautiful place almost any time of the year. Well, the story of Innisfree starts in 1922 when a man named Walter Beck, who was 58 years old and an artist, married a woman named Marion Burt Stone. And they bought this piece of land near Millbrook. Now, Walter Beck, I don't know that he had a lot of means, but Marion Burt Stone was the heiress to a mining fortune. So that was kind of nice for Walter. And it was a late in life marriage, and they certainly must have had a lovely time because they created this lovely garden. They built a large Queen Anne mansion house, and they built formal gardens on the site. But they figured out quite quickly that they had made a mistake, and these formal gardens didn't really fit this naturalistic landscape. So they took those gardens out and they started building what they called Chinese scroll painting gardens, or Chinese cup gardens. Now Walter had traveled to London and seen a collection of Chinese scroll paintings, and I've seen a few of those, and often there's kind of rocks and picturesque kind of craggly trees in these scroll paintings, and that's what he wanted to create, these little scenes around this lake. And that's what you see when you walk around the lake at Innisfree. So you start out, I always start out kind of going, I think it must be counterclockwise around the lake. You can go either way. And there's a very shady kind of an area along the water, and these rock formations are there. And they have what they call mist fountains. And you can see in the top of both of those pictures, there's kind of a cloud there, and that's this mist kind of coming up out of the rocks, and it gives it a very atmospheric feeling. And there's standing stones and dripping water and little ferns and shady plants, all sorts of interesting things to look at. And again, this is the spirit of this scroll painting or this cup garden that gets you to slow down and take in this small vignette here that they've created. Here's more dripping water off of the rocks and the ferns and the mosses and the weeping plants. Then we walk up the hill a little farther, and this is kind of the area where the mansion house was. The big Queen Anne mansion house was taken down. That's no longer there, and those original formal gardens are no longer there, but the terraces are still there. And here's a mist fountain on one of the lawns. So you can kind of climb through this area and look down again to the lake. There's a very naturalistic plantings. Nothing very formal here. This is about as far from Kaicut and the Rockefeller's house as you can get and still have a garden. That bottom picture there is, of course, showing the Joe Pye weed, which is one of our native wildflowers that's blooming right now, and a very lovely thing. And again, weeping plants, interesting plants, not all native plants by any means, plants from around the world, but different foliage colors, different textures, and lots of interesting things to see on these terraces. So there's some of the different colors and textures of the leaves. Again, not really a flower garden at all. There's very few flowering plants. You're not going to see perennials here in large masses. You're going to see groupings of perennials and used in natural kind of conditions, but not big formal borders at all. And here I promise to show you these again. The right belt chairs show up at Innisfree Garden among the rocky terraces there. They do have the lotus plant, and the lotus plant is a very interesting one. It's an aquatic plant. It's from the Middle Eastern part of the world. It's got a lot of mystical properties to it. You can eat many parts of the lotus plant, and here's the pond with the lotus plants in it. And that reminds me, I have to read you the poem that inspired all this. The poem is by William Butler Yeats, and I'm certainly not a poet. I know a little bit about the poetry I like, but I can't tell you anything about poetry at all. But I'll read just the first part of this. It's called The Lake Isle of Innisfree. And he says, I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honeybee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. So this Innisfree is a mystical place. It's a place of retreat, a place to get away from the world, a place to enjoy nature. And certainly Innisfree in Dutchess County is all of those things. Again, some more of the unusual weeping plants, and that's called a button bush that's down by the lily pond. One of the most famous parts of Innisfree, if you ever see some of the coffee table books that have been done of the photographs there, is the section with the Turtle Rock, the Dragon Rock, and the Owl Rock out near the lake. And it's just a lovely promontory overlooking the water. And you can't see anything else surrounding this lake. It's all woods and wonderful nature. So Innisfree is a wonderful place. It's open. It's been open since the 1990s, I believe. What else can I tell you? Mr. Beck died in 1954, and a man named Lester Collins was a Harvard landscape architect. He actually designed some of the later features there. So Innisfree is a wonderful, wonderful, mystical kind of a place to visit. So we go a little further north again, and we go to Poughkeepsie, and here's a garden called Locust Grove. Now, Locust Grove is one of the old historic estates along the Hudson River. This was the home of Samuel F.B. Morse. And if we were all together, I would say, what did Samuel F.B. Morse do? Well, a lot of people might say he invented the telegraph, and that's exactly right. Morse code, think of that. But he was also a very famous artist and a very famous painter. And so he really had a couple different careers. And this was his Hudson Valley estate. He lived here from 1847 to 1872. And after that, this estate passed to the Young family, and I believe one of his daughters was married into that family, and they lived here until 1975. The property is now about 200 acres, and you can see the river from this house. There's a clearing down to the river. So it's a very classic example of a Hudson River Valley estate. The house is described as Italianate. There's a wonderful tower there and porches, and you can just picture the Victorians enjoying a summer afternoon at Locust Grove. Some of the plantings are very Victorian in taste. In those years, they liked what we call now bedding out. Lots of annuals, very colorful foliage plants, big bold leaves like the elephant ear plant there, urns overflowing with color, and the bottom picture there shows the red and white tulips in the spring. So this was a very expensive way to do horticulture because you had to change these bedding out designs several times a year, and often they would have greenhouses and gardeners that would take care of all of this for them. There's also a very large vegetable garden that grows heirloom varieties and a very large flower cutting garden. So it's a very lovely place to see and a great example of one of the Hudson River Valley estates that looks a lot like it might have way back in the day. Okay, another little place in the country as we go up a little further north in the Hyde Park area is this one called the Vanderbilt Mansion. Now, this to me is really, again, a power garden. The Vanderbilts were, again, another wealthy family. This was a property purchased in 1895 by Frederick William Vanderbilt, who was the grandson of Commodore Vanderbilt, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who started the empire that became the New York Central Railroad. This Vanderbilt, Frederick, actually was very interested in horticulture. He had a degree in horticulture from Yale University and really was quite interested in anything in the line of gardening and trees and that sort of thing. The story goes that he would enter lots of things into the Dutchess County Fair every year, and the horticulture competition must have been very vigorous then back in those days. So this is his house. It's a very formal sort of house. It's run by the National Park Service nowadays. The gardens are being restored. Now this is an area of what we would call, again, bedding out that originally would have had a series of greenhouses here for the estate. And in the background, there's part of the Italian garden. So these are different levels going down a hill, and you can walk on the gravel paths and see these different examples of the remains of the gardens. Not all the gardens are there now, but they're very well taken care of, mostly by volunteers. And this is, again, another picture of the Italian garden. The statue is called Barefoot Kate, and it's quite a lovely water feature. There's also a very large rose garden, and it's got what's called a loggia, or another example of a summer house, or we could just call it a gazebo there. So again, another lovely estate garden in the Vanderbilt style. Now, we've been on the east side of the Hudson River for this whole trip. We have to jog over to the west side and give those folks a nod. And I just have a couple pictures here of the Mohonk Mountain House. Now, this is a very large hotel, a large inn. It's quite a complex. If you've ever been there, it's quite a very large, old, rambling place, lots of big porches. You can just picture people in their summer attire, riding in the carriages along the paths and visiting the various summer houses and admiring the views of the Catskills and the Hudson River Valley. This was started in 1869 by the Smiley brothers, and in 1883 they started planting out very large gardens. And certainly those gardens are what we see there today. This is a picture way up on the hill. I believe I took that years and years ago, looking down on the lake. And these are just pictures of the gardens. And again, very large displays of color. This picture was taken quite a while ago, and it's very large blocks of the same color. I think the plantings have kind of evolved now, and they're a little more sophisticated. This was a picture from the late summer or fall, and you can see there's dahlias there, lots of colorful things in the pink and orange families there. Very eye-popping kind of gardening. And again, a lot of money to plant this sort of thing out, but this was the Victorian taste at the time. You have to really take your walking shoes if you go to Mohonk, because there's lots of different carriage trails, lots of different paths, and there's over 100 little gazebos on the property that you can wander around and visit. So it's a wonderful place. They've kind of updated some of their facilities in recent years, and it's a nice place to spend a week or a weekend. This is a little garden that a lot of people don't know about at Bard College. And again, you can see in the background there, it's the Hudson River and the Catskill Mountains in the view. There's a little part of the campus there called the Levy Institute. And it's kind of a out of the way section, but it's an old estate garden, and it has a very formal small garden that's taken very good care of, called Blythewood. And I've been visited that a couple times. It's a garden that was created in 1900, and it's got a little formal fountain there, very formal types of plantings, and just a lovely, lovely little place overlooking the river. Now, if you go to Bard College and ask for directions to the garden, make sure you ask one of the students. The day we went there, we saw a professor, and we said, "Where is the Blythewood garden?" And he said, "There's no garden here." And then we asked the student, and of course the students knew where the garden was. So they are the experts when it comes to those things. Again, in an old and new picture, it looks a lot like it did back in the day in 1900. Okay, now no tour could be complete of the Hudson Valley without saying a word about Olana. Again, Olana doesn't really have formal gardens. There's a very small flower garden below the wall that sort of supports the whole upper lawn, but Olana is just such an incredible house. Of course, this was the house of Frederick Church, built in the Persian style, and it's just a magnificent piece of architecture, unlike any other house anywhere in the world, probably. And of course, Frederick Church loved his landscape. He planted thousands of trees. One source said that he planted 1,000 trees a year for 20 years in order to achieve his goal of this rolling landscape and these swaths of trees on this site. When he bought this property, I'm sure it was very open. It was probably farmland and grazed or cultivated, and he replanted the forests and put back the trees where he thought they should go. So there's just a picture of Olana as you walk up the drive. We did some hiking here in the spring when we were in the pandemic, in the throes of the worst part of the pandemic, and really discovered a lot of the carriage roads that are at Olana, and they're wonderful to walk around in. And there's a view of just the landscape looking south, the Catskill Mountains, and of course the Hudson River. And those two smaller pictures are just different pictures of the little garden below the wall. Has lots of different flowers in it. I imagine they probably used that as a cutting garden back in the day when they wanted flowers for the house. So now you have to indulge me a little bit as we get towards the end here. We are going to stray from the Hudson River for a moment. because we have to take a little detour over to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. And I do that because I want to show you just a couple pictures of really one of my favorite all-time gardens that I've ever been to. And this is called Naumkeag. It's on the hill above Stockbridge, and it's the home of, or was the home of, the Choate family. A man named Joseph Hodges Choate was a New York City lawyer and an ambassador to England. And he had this house built in 1887 as a summer retreat. So it's a large shingle style house. It's kind of a rambling structure. Lots of wonderful rooms with big porch and big windows overlooking the wonderful countryside there. You can't really see the Hudson River, but you'll have to excuse me for that. So the Choate family lives in this house, and they have a daughter named Mabel Choate. And Mabel Choate inherited this house in 1929. Mabel never married, but she really loved her garden at Naumkeag. And she teamed up with a man named Fletcher Steele. Now, Fletcher Steele was a landscape architect. He was from Rochester, New York, and he was really sort of an avant-garde fellow for his time. He really liked to design sort of gardens that were on the cutting edge, and this was 1920s, 1930s, into the 1950s. And this is a picture of what's called the afternoon garden. It's on the side of the house, and you can see there's this crazy parterre of, I believe it's boxwood. It's surrounding different colors of gravel. There's a small pool in the middle of the picture there. It's actually a black pool. I think it's a mirror covered in water. And then there's 4 little circular fountains around that. Towards the bottom of the picture, you can actually see some black stone. And yes, that's coal they used. And those poles around the edges are designed to look like Venetian poles from the canals of Venice. And there's a grapevine growing along that. And this whole creation was done in 1926, called the Afternoon Garden. So you can imagine maybe having a few cocktails there, having some refreshments in the afternoon, enjoying the shade here on a summer day at Naumkeag. So that was one of Fletcher Steele's creations for Mabel Choate. This is the other very famous thing that you see in a lot of landscape architecture books. On the left-hand side, there's a runnel, again, that Islamic garden feature, a narrow band of water. And up where that tree is, you can just see in the picture a little piece of the Venetian pole. The afternoon garden is up there. This water runs down the hill from the afternoon garden, and then it comes to a very steep hillside. And Mabel Choate wanted a stairway that she could take to go down this hill to visit her greenhouse. So Fletcher Steele obliged and created this structure, which is today called the Blue Steps. And it's a series of stairways that go down gracefully with these very gracefully curved handrails, the white birch trees, the clipped yews, and then these blue fountains. And it's really a fantastic feature. You know, there's no other feature quite like this in an American garden, and that was Fletcher Steele's Blue Steps. When I started going to Naumkeag probably 25 or 30 years ago, they were actually not in great condition, and they were painted a different color blue, and they've been restored, and this is the proper color blue that they've decided upon for the Fletcher Steele Blue Steps. Okay, so wrapping up, we go over to Albany County, and there's a couple gardens of note there. One of them is at Cornell Cooperative Extension, our sister organization over in Voorheesville. Their office is in a rural sort of a setting or suburban setting outside the village of Voorheesville. They have lots of space, and they've created a series of theme gardens around their building. And it's really worth a trip to see their theme gardens. They have lots of different plantings there. There's a vegetable garden, there's an herb garden, there's a wonderful gazebo. And just take a stroll around this, otherwise an institutional building, but it's really been beautified by the master gardeners, working very hard and over a long period of time, raising their own money to create their memorial garden. So that's in Voorheesville, and it's at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Albany County. One of the old houses in Albany has its garden, This is called the Pembroke Mansion, and this was built in 1797 to 1798 for the brother-in-law of the patroon, Stephen Van Rensselaer, and the brother-in-law's name was Abraham Pembroke. He was married to, I believe, a sister of Stephen Van Rensselaer. Now, Abraham Pembroke was quite a man in his own right. He did lots of different things. He was a colonel in the Revolutionary War and commanded his own brigade at the Battle of Saratoga. He was also twice the mayor of Albany. So he lived in a rather grand house, and it still stands there today. And this is a garden that is maintained by the master gardeners, most of whom are from Albany County. And there's lots of plantings of bulbs there. It's quite a bulb show in the springtime. Lots of tulips, lots of daffodils, quite a great place to see. Worth a stop down there sometime in probably the end of April or the beginning of May. And the gardens really look great in the summertime too. There's lots of annuals, lots of bulb plantings there. And they do a great job. And again, this is a garden that's really done on a shoestring budget. And it's really quite a lovely place. So that's a shout out to the Pembroke Mansion. And of course, we have our own demonstration garden in Rensselaer County. If you go down to the Robert C. Parker School, which is in North Greenbush off of Route 43, we have our Rensselaer County Master Gardener Demonstration Garden, where we have a series of themed gardens. This is an old picture of our pollinator garden. And we have a vegetable garden up in the left-hand corner. We have an ornamental grass garden, whoops. And normally this time of the year, we would be teaching classes there. And we have classes in the evening. During the summertime, they're free, and we cover all sorts of gardening topics. But of course, this year, we're not able to do that, but hopefully next year, you're all invited back to the demonstration garden, and hopefully we'll be doing our classes there. So that wraps up our little tour. And again, if anybody has any questions, maybe we can answer questions now, or if you want to sign up for our webinars, you can certainly send me an email at dhc3@cornell.edu. Or if you'd like that copy of the list of the Hudson Valley Gardens, I can certainly send you that as well. So we're just about on time at 7 o'clock.
I know, David, that was excellent.
Oh.
Now I have my whole rest of my summer and fall planned out.
Yeah, it's a great staycation, right?
It is, it is. Well, since you can't leave the state, right? I don't know whether you want, would it be easiest if people had questions to put it in a chat?
Sure, that would be great.
If people have any questions, you can just type it in there and we'll give it a couple of minutes. And if not, then we'll just thank you very much. That was excellent. Very, very informative.
Oh, what was the name of the chair? The chair is called a Rietveld chair, and I believe it's let me think if I can spell it, R-I-E-V-E-L-T maybe? Rietveld? I believe that's right. And I didn't know that until I went to the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the chair was on display, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's the Hudson Valley Garden chair. But I could be wrong on the spelling, but that's the name of the chair. I certainly appreciate everybody tuning in. Thank you all. It was a lovely evening. We could have all been out pulling weeds, but it was maybe a little more fun to be talking about gardens at this point. I've kind of a little tired of pulling weeds at this point in the season, but we still have some good gardening left to go. And luckily, with the temperatures down a little bit, it's been kind of nice to be outside.
It has. Well, thank you so much, David. That was a nice way to spend the evening.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
All right. And as I said, I'll try and get this up on our YouTube for the libraries. So have a nice evening, everyone.
Super. Thank you.
Thanks again.